One moment, Rick Watson was being unfairly arrested. The next, he was saving the very officer's life. This incredible story will restore your faith in humanity. It was a regular Saturday afternoon in Castroville, California, when Rick, a 26-year-old medical student, found himself in an unexpected confrontation. A stranger, aggressive and unstable, started harassing him on the street. Rick tried to avoid trouble, but when the man attacked, he had no choice but to defend himself. A crowd gathered, and soon, Officer Frank Lawson arrived. But instead of hearing Rick out, the officer shoved him, ignoring his pleas for fairness. Just as he was about to handcuff Rick, something shocking happened. Officer Lawson suddenly collapsed, suffering a heart attack. In that moment, Rick had a choice. Despite being mistreated, he immediately rushed to help. Using his medical training, he performed CPR, working tirelessly until the officer finally gasped for air. The same man who had tried to arrest him was now alive. Because of him. This act of compassion changed everything. Stay with us to hear the full story of how one young man turned chaos into kindness. And if you find this story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible true stories. Rick Watson was the kind of person who preferred to stay in the background. At 26 years old, he was a dedicated medical student, spending most of his time buried in textbooks, attending lectures, and preparing for exams. He wasn't the type to seek attention or trouble. He simply wanted to focus on his studies and take care of his family. Hardworking and quiet, Rick's routine was predictable. If he wasn't at the library, he was at home, reviewing notes or researching medical cases. It was a typical Saturday afternoon in Castroville, California, and Rick had just finished a quick lunch at McDonald's. With his mind already drifting to an upcoming project, he walked down the familiar streets toward home, barely paying attention to the world around him. The sun was warm, the sidewalks busy with weekend crowds, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But in just a few moments, Rick's peaceful afternoon would take an unexpected turn, one that would test not only his strength, but his very sense of morality. Little did he know, he was about to cross paths with a man who would change everything. As Rick walked home, lost in thought, he barely noticed the man coming toward him until it was too late. They collided, just a slight brush of shoulders, but instead of moving on, the man stopped abruptly. His wild eyes locked onto Rick, filled with anger. "You think you can just walk around like you own the place?" he barked, his voice loud enough to turn heads. Rick frowned, confused. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" Before he could finish, the man shoved him, hard. Rick stumbled back, his pulse quickening. He wasn't looking for trouble, but something about this man's unhinged glare told him this wasn't just a random outburst. "Just walk away," Rick said firmly, holding his hands up in peace. But the man wasn't listening. He stepped forward again, shoving Rick even harder. A few passers-by stopped, whispering among themselves, unsure whether to intervene or keep their distance. Then, without warning, the man swung. His punch was wild, sloppy, but it landed on Rick's shoulder, sending him off balance. Instinct took over. Rick dodged the next swing and responded with a controlled push, trying to create distance. But the man kept coming. Within seconds, the two were locked in a struggle, fists flying as the crowd watched in shock. Rick was stronger, more controlled, but he didn't want to hurt the man. He just wanted the fight to stop. Yet no matter how much he tried to push the man away, the attacks kept coming. It was clear. This wasn't just a random altercation. Something was seriously wrong. And just when it seemed the fight couldn't escalate any further, a sharp voice cut through the chaos. "Break it up!" Rick turned to see a police officer rushing toward them. But what happened next was something he never could have expected. The sharp command cut through the tense air. "Break it up!" Officer Frank Lawson pushed through the crowd, his uniform crisp, his expression hard. Without hesitation, he grabbed Rick by the arm and yanked him. Rick didn't hesitate. His medical training took over as he pressed 2 fingers to Officer Lawson's neck, searching for a pulse. It was faint. Too faint. His breaths were shallow, his face pale. There was no time to waste. Rick's voice rang out. "Someone call an ambulance! Now!" But the crowd remained frozen, their shock paralyzing them. Some held their phones, but no one dialed. It was as if they couldn't believe what they were witnessing. The same man who had just been so forceful now, lying helpless on the ground. Rick didn't wait. He knew every second counted. He positioned his hands over Lawson's chest, locked his elbows, and began chest compressions. The rhythmic pressure pushed against the officer's ribcage as Rick counted in his head, his focus razor-sharp. He ignored the murmurs around him, ignored the exhaustion creeping into his arms. This wasn't about anything else now, just saving a life. "Come on, stay with me," Rick muttered under his breath, pushing harder, refusing to let this man slip away. The minutes felt endless, each compression a desperate fight against time. The crowd held its breath, watching as Rick worked, sweat forming on his brow. Then, finally, a gasp. Officer Lawson's body jolted slightly as he sucked in a ragged breath. His eyelids fluttered open, his gaze unfocused. He was alive. A ripple of stunned relief washed over the crowd. Some let out shaky breaths, others whispered in disbelief. Rick sat back, chest rising and falling, watching as the officer slowly came to. The man who had just been moments from death was now breathing again, because of him. The silence that followed was almost louder than the chaos before. The crowd, once frozen in shock, now stood in awe, their expressions shifting from disbelief to admiration. Whispers rippled through them as they processed what had just happened. The same man who had been moments away from being arrested had just saved the officer's life. Officer Lawson lay there, dazed, his breath still uneven. His eyes darted around before landing on Rick, the very person he had shoved, restrained, and nearly handcuffed. Reality sank in. His chest rose and fell as he struggled to speak, his voice weak but laced with something Rick hadn't heard before. Humility. You saved me," Lawson murmured, his gaze locking onto Rick's. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, harder than the heart attack itself. Just minutes ago, he had treated Rick like a criminal. Now, that same man had just pulled him back from the brink of death. Rick, still catching his breath, nodded. "Yeah," he said simply, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You're going to be okay, but you need medical attention." Lawson swallowed hard. His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "I was wrong." He blinked, his usual authoritative presence replaced with something almost vulnerable. "I misjudged you. He paused, struggling to find the words. "Thank you." Before Rick could respond, the distant sound of sirens filled the air. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the storefronts as an ambulance weaved through traffic, racing toward them. The crowd finally broke out of their trance, some taking out their phones, others exchanging glances of admiration. Rick exhaled deeply, stepping back as the paramedics rushed in. He had done what needed to be done. No grudges, no second thoughts, just the instinct to save a life, even when that life belonged to someone who had wronged him. A few days had passed since that life-changing moment on the street. Rick had tried to move on, burying himself in his studies, but the memory of that day lingered. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from the police department. Rick hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. As his eyes scanned the words, his breath caught. Officer Lawson had personally nominated him for recognition. The letter expressed deep gratitude for his selflessness and courage. But that wasn't all. As a token of appreciation, the department was awarding him a full scholarship to attend an advanced medical conference in Chicago, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Rick sat there for a moment, stunned. He had never expected anything in return. He didn't save the officer for recognition or rewards. He had simply done what he knew was right. Yet, this acknowledgement meant more than he could put into words. A few days later, Officer Lawson himself showed up at Rick's university. This time, there was no tension, no authority-driven force, just a man looking for a conversation. They sat together, not discussing the fight, the heart attack, or even the near arrest. Instead, they talked about life, about change, about the things that truly matter. As their conversation wrapped up, Lawson handed Rick a small note. In simple, handwritten words, it read, "You taught me more in minutes than I learned in years." Rick folded the note carefully, a small smile forming. Some moments in life changed everything, not just for one person, but for both. At the end of the day, this story isn't just about a fight or even about saving a life. It's about how compassion can win over conflict. Rick had every reason to walk away, to let bitterness take over, but he chose differently. He chose to do what was right, even for someone who had wronged him. Now, I ask you, what would you have done in Rick's place? Would you have stepped in to save the officer, or let fate take its course? Let me know in the comments below. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.